Errol the Truth Spence, the former three-belt unified welterweight champion. Sounds like he's nearing a finalization to fight Tim Tszyu, former 154-pound champion, in Australia in the summertime of June 6th to June 13th. ESPN and Ring are reporting. Yeah, let's start. I think first of all, to get the marketing side of this fight out of the way, it's a little bit of a fall from grace for Errol Spence, who one of the things always touted about him is what a draw he's been, having several strong numbers at Cowboy Stadium, AT&T Stadium down there in Fort Worth, Texas, against Mikey Garcia, against Yordenis Ugas, Danny Garcia, and now having to fight on the road, maybe to speculate because his minimums couldn't be met, what he wants in the United States for any kind of fight, whether it would have been a Keith Thurman or a Sebastian Fundora, which was rumored to happen 2 years ago in 2024. So to get that money and to get for the right kind of opponent and money, he'll have to go on the road to Australia to fight Tim Tszyu. The Australians, they sold out a few Kambosos fights against Haney. They support Tim Tszyu. So perhaps this is where it all makes sense for him, not just the money-wise, but against the right kind of opponent to come back against. Not a streaking in his prime fighter, but a fighter in the same boat as he is, seemingly faded, still with a name, and let's see how much both fighters have in the tank. This is a good matchup, though. This is a good loser goes home matchup, and stylistically, these two guys at the peak of their powers had entertaining come-forward styles, so should be some good action in it. What's your first thoughts, Raheem?
I don't see it as what was the word that you
Yeah, that
used?
might have been a little strong. Fall from grace. Yeah,
Yeah, fall from
coming in
grace
hot.
or even a concession.
Yeah.
I see it as a savvy move from Errol Spence.
Mm.
It's 3 years out of the ring. He took a beat down, not just physically, but to be fair, probably to his ego against Terrence Crawford. It was a difficult defeat to overcome, sitting at home with your family, post car accident and post, personal issues. I never really believed in the build up to the fight that he believed what he was saying. I think that was the fight he had to take at the time to get the money that he wanted and needed. Maybe he even in the back of his mind thought that might be his last fight at the time. Maybe he doesn't come back after this. Not that he went into the ring absolutely defeated, but I think he went into the ring knowing that this might not go his way. And he was going to give the best effort that he had inside him, but also knowing that he wasn't 100% the Errol Spence at his peak, climbing through those ropes even before the first bell rung. He took a beating. I don't believe that the time between then and now was wasted, though. And the reason I think it's a savvy move is because fighting in your backyard, making it a huge return of Errol Spence, putting all that pressure on yourself, putting the whole of Texas or Dallas in Dallas Cowboy Stadium or making it a massive event might be more than he needs to put on his shoulders right now. And if you go to Australia and stop Zoo, then it don't matter what the judges or the crowd says or does. You return, and people will say that everything was against you. You didn't have the big money. You didn't have the big build-up. You were on. It was an away game against Zoo, who's not at all a shot fighter. I mean, he's got something to prove, but he's still definitely a solid opponent and with all the advantages. And you go out there and stop him, and then your next fight, bring that home. Then bring the home crowd. Then make that your homecoming with a little bit of momentum, some confidence, and off the back of a stoppage of a solid opponent. I like that story.
I don't think Tim Tszyu's a shot fighter, but his vitality as a fighter has been evaporating before our eyes in these last 3 out of 4 fights. The first and second Fundora fight, you could tell Fundora got better from those fights. His sense of distance got better, a little savvier, knows when to pelt guys with shots and take something off, and then knows when to turn up the heat and throw the heavy heat. like he did in fight number 2. But you could also see from Tszyu that his punch resistance has been fading, being stopped in 2 of his last 3 fights. And Bakram didn't exactly set the world on fire against Josh Kelly, but styles make fights too. Kelly's a much different style than Tim Tszyu. And then you mentioned Spence going back to the Crawford fight. I mean, I don't know if it ever got reported, but I did know that in the last several weeks in camp for the Crawford fight, he was not sparring. In part because, so that speaks to your point that maybe deep down he knew it really wasn't going to go his way. I think everybody agrees that on the night of the fight, something about his demeanor seemed off. There was no universe where Errol Spence was beating Terrence Crawford, but I do think it's fair to use your eyeballs and say that, and Spence was stylistically made for Crawford in a lot of ways. A lot of guys are, but I think that wasn't the Errol Spence that fought Mikey Garcia or Lamont Peterson or Kell Brook. Wasn't that same sharp Texas strong bull. And I started seeing signs of that even as far back as the Sean Porter fight. So, but this is a good fight. I think once upon a time, well, let me go with you. Who do you think a 2023 era Tim Tszyu, the guy who stopped Tony Harrison and beat Terrell Gausha and was undefeated and picked up the WBO title, how would that version look against the Errol Spence that fought your Dennis Ugas in 2022?
Well, let me address the point
Yeah.
you raised before the question real quick. Errol Spence, I believe, needed a break.
Mm.
He could have started that 3 years before the Crawford fight and then been ready. But he knew that that fight wasn't going to wait that long. He knew that he had to cash in when he did. I think he got pressured and pushed into that fight, not by anybody else, but by himself and his knowing that you let that go in that moment and it may never come back. That was what got him in the ring. I credit both fighters, as I did at the time, with making the fight that the fans wanted to see close enough to when they wanted to see it and being the guys who put their promoters and networks and everyone who would want to stand in the way to the side and got their money and got the fight and got the fans what they wanted. However, I think even at its inception, Spence knew it wasn't the time for him to have that fight if he was going to be at his best. These 3 years, hopefully, those were rebuild years mentally. I think he had to get some personal shit in order. He had to get his mind right. He had to get ready to get a return that was going to be something that was worthy of the Spence that we once knew, maybe against an Ugas in his prime, like Mikey Garcia time. I don't believe that he is diminished at all by taking this fight in Australia, and he gets credit for the Tszyu fight. That's the kind of fight he should have right now. Like, Tszyu is absolutely a credible opponent, has an opportunity to win, is giving him all the advantages, and if he goes out there, like I say, stops him on top of that, that is a master stroke. And then come back home and do your thing. I think Prime Errol Spence beats Prime Tszyu. Listen, and they're gonna love this, but I said it and I'll stand on it. Before car accident, Prime Spence, I was picking against Crawford. I was picking him to win that fight. And post car accident, I was picking him to lose that fight, but not because in his prime he couldn't do it. I always believed that he could, but because he's a changed man at that point, and I knew off record certain things that were happening in his private life that just weren't going to contribute to him being a focused, high-performing, excellent athlete at his prime. There was things taken away from what he was going to be able to do in the ring, period. And you can't even be a step off your game against Terrence Crawford. And even when I was picking him, I realized by a razor margin, it still would have been my pick. However, that's not taking anything from Crawford. I'm not in any stretch saying, oh, Crawford couldn't have won at any point. But that's how different I perceived Spence before that car accident and post the car accident and what I learned about the other struggles that were going on. So now we'll see if that rest pays dividends. If he's had time to reconstitute his fire, had time to refocus, had time to clear some other things out of his life and his system. And now return and listen, at was it 36? He's not likely to ever be prime Spence, but I think, like I say, if this time is rest and not wear, he can come back much stronger than the Spence we saw against Crawford. And that guy beat Tszyu.
I hear in the faint distance the stampede of the Crawford cult of personality coming for you with impending doom in the comments now for your heretic ways, Raheem. I will go ahead.
There's a reason that that fight was a super fight because it was a pick'em fight at one time. There was an argument to be made for both guys. I remember the tide turning. I remember when it was more people saying Spence than Crawford. Then I remember it was more people saying Crawford than Spence. Then I remember the car accident and most people saying Crawford. But you have to take yourself back to before. I don't think that fight happened when it would have been the best matchup. It definitely happened, and it was better to have happened than not. But when they were both at their peaking moments, and that fight would have been as evenly contested as it could have ever been, we missed that moment.
I think it still happened to where they both had their O's, they were both undefeated, and all four belts were on the line. So it goes down in history as, Crawford dominated by knockout. And again, they were both undefeated, and it was for the undisputed title. I always picked Crawford to beat Spence. I agree with you. There was a time where I felt it was more competitive than it would have turned out to be ultimately in 2023. I just think Crawford was the best counterpuncher of his generation, and Spence is at his best as this volume pressure fighter behind his jab, whose head was usually on the line. And I think that style matchup always favored Crawford. I will concede that pre-car accident Spence and Crawford still growing into the 147-pound weight class, which he was warning Errol Spence and PBC about. He was saying, you guys better, I'm only getting stronger. And then who knew he would shoot all the way up to 168 one day. But early welterweight Terrence Crawford, Teddy Atlas, to speak to Raheem's point, Teddy Atlas was questioning, was he too light in the ass? That was the word Teddy used around 2018, 2019, especially 2017 when he came to the division and knocked out Jeff Horn. But to relitigate it, I just always thought Crawford's counterpunching prowess against a guy who was going to allow him counterpunching opportunities all night long was the stylistic matchup that Crawford would have always won. But I will agree, him growing into the weight still, those first two or so years of the weight class against a Spence who was very strong. And I started to see something in Spence's legs ringside in the Porter fight that, this dude's not looking as massive a tank at 47, that weight cut and the lifestyle stuff that eventually caught up to him. And I remember even asking him, because even before the accident, he was visibly drunk, talking about Regis Prograrius at the Barclays Center and stuff like that. And I remember asking him ringside.
Was that my video?
Huh?
Was that my video?
It was a press conference, so it was yours and a few others, yes. But I think you may have interviewed him that night.
That's what I mean. This one went viral. They were like
with Broner and everybody.
Yeah.
That was your interview?
Yeah.
All right, put some respect on Raheem's name. Yes, that was your interview. But that made me ask him about it at Caleb Plant, Jose Uzcategui's fight, and he just kind of non-answered it and said, "Watch what I do to Mikey Garcia." And Mikey, who was undersized but undefeated and a hell of a puncher from 26 to 40, he looked excellent in that fight. I think in a lot of ways that was actually his finest hour, even though in retrospect people will fairly point out Garcia was undersized. Back to Tszyu and Spence. I give credit to Tszyu in that second Fundora fight, man. He, even in person, seeing it in person on television doesn't quite do it justice how much he went for broke in that last round before he had to quit on the stool, retire on the stool. And that even makes me look at the Thurman-Fundora fight. That fight could be funner than expected if Thurman takes chances like that and jumps in with big shots, because Fundora, even though he's gotten better with his distance, his head is still there a lot. But Tszyu, man, he got dominated in that fight, but was tough, man. He moved his head a lot. He tried to parry and slip counter a lot against this way taller guy. But yeah, the point you're making, is Errol Spence 3 years just completely rusty and washed, or is he 3 years rested and going to be a little rejuvenated? I think at their best, Spence had more volume than Tim Tszyu. Tim Tszyu moves his head a little bit better, though, than Errol Spence. We never saw Errol Spence at 154. One of the things that made him so effective in his run at 47 was he was almost always the bigger man. At 54, we never saw how his power and how his everything held up against naturally bigger men, bigger frames, at least, if not, if they're not all taller like Fundora is. So there's a lot of question marks in this fight. That's what this fight is one big question mark on both sides.
For me, it's a counterintuitive fight. All the things that would normally be puzzling, if not certainly a disadvantage, I believe Spence is turning into his advantage. Even the 54 of it all, like you're not struggling to make weight. He's not putting any added pressure on himself or circumstances that he's going to have to live up to or achieve in addition to winning the fight. I think he's just a better fighter than Tszyu. Like, I think not stressing any other element of the fight other than getting in there, being relaxed, doing what you do best, and coming back, which I have to believe that he is 100% confident that this time he spent away from the ring has been rejuvenating, refocusing, reconstituting his abilities, and is 100% confident that he comes in there and surprises us all how little ring rust there is, how ready he is, how sharp he is. That is also counterintuitive because I'm a big ring rust guy. I'm a big, you got to be fighting to be sharp in a fight. I don't know how sharp he needs to be. And Tszyu taking a fight in between, if he in fact does that, is telling on the one hand that he knows what kind of challenge is ahead of him, and he himself needs to sharpen up and get in rhythm, which might be the one thing that I'm not sure favors Spence in this case. If Tszyu takes a good fight, gets in his rhythm, is sharper, makes himself a little busy ahead of this fight, and then goes in there, without the rust on, then maybe it takes Spence a little long in this fight to get his rhythm. Maybe that advantages Tszyu. But again, I'm a believer that Spence is at his best, at his peak, certainly better than Tszyu. And if this time spent at what is going to happen in the corner, what is the trainer situation? What is the strategy going in? What is the conditioning? How much time has he been spending in the gym? Spence is always a little bit difficult to read because he has a little bit laissez-faire delivery. His eyes are sleepy, so I can't tell if he's tired or hyped. He doesn't really give a lot of energy. Certainly that's true in these last few interviews I've seen of him. But I also think he might just be trying to keep shit sleepy. So he shocks us on the night, not putting any added emphasis on anything. So when the bell rings, we can all be like, whoa, like this is what I'm expecting from him. This is what I believe is possible. But again, not really knowing the details of how these last 3 years are spent, the proof will only be proven in the ring.
It's Valentine's Day. He's got 4 months to get a tune-up. The fight's supposed to be in 4 months, Raheem. I don't know if he's got enough time to get a tune-up in.
Yeah, but they're saying Tszyu is gonna find a way to get a tune-up in. Do you think that's not true?
I mean,
I think Tszyu might take a walk.
Got a whole lot of time. I mean, was he fighting him in 3 weeks? Is he?
I mean, I don't know. But
I don't know. I don't know.
Again, these dates aren't even firm. These are floated dates. So
yeah.
Maybe this fight happens a little later. Maybe Tszyu does just take something to get just a shakeout kind of fight. That's certainly possible. Who knows? But if he doesn't, I think that bodes better for Spence. I think, if they both come in as is, that's yet another chalk mark on the Spence side of the equation for me.
Well, you could look at it but one guy's coming in, even though he's been losing his last 3 out of 4 with activity, and the other guy isn't. Or you could look at it as the other guy's coming in and taking off punishment, and the other guy's gotten rest. So
that's exactly how I'm looking at it.
That's how you look, right? And one guy we saw this with Tiafimo, and Shakur Stevenson. We saw this with Canelo Alvarez and Terrence Crawford. One guy has continued to make this weight year after year, and the other guy's coming up to the weight fresh. This is a more comfortable weight cut than it is potentially for the other guy. Although Zhu's not a big guy, he's 5'8", but not a big 154. I will say though, when you say that Spence was certainly the more decorated fighter than Tim Tszyu, certainly has more volume and a better jab than Tim Tszyu, certainly the better decorated amateur, not just professional, than Tim Tszyu. I think though, punch for punch, Tim Tszyu is sharper. And I think Tim Tszyu moves his head off the line more than he does, and with a little bit better reflexes with what he does. So put all that together, and interesting crossroads fight.
I would have said the same about Mikey Garcia. Granted, I know Mikey Garcia was lighter on the weight, but I'd have said the same about him. And I believe Spence has the ability to punish a guy like that. I like him fighting long. I like like you say, the volume of punches, that jab. You're just being rained down upon and not able to stop him from hitting you and not able to best him, because what he does best is hard to beat.
What if Zhu's balance is a little better though? The Errol's balance those last few fights, even the Ugas fight when I watched it last night at times.
Yeah, I mean, listen.
That's why he was susceptible to the counters from Crawford so much.
There's a tale of two Spence.
Yeah, yeah.
There's two Spence, and I'm betting that the first one may still have some fire in that tank and needed that rest. And what he was Spence fighting on post accident, especially, was a bit of reserve fuel, no pun intended. I think if this rest benefits him in the way that I hope it does, it's been the best decision he could have made by stepping back and getting his shit together and coming back when he was ready, which if that is now, we might get wowed all the way in Australia with all the advantages stacked against him. That's the way to come back. And then return to the States, to your backyard, for the big money, for the big show, for the big return.
What if and look, I am looking forward to all four fighters performing on the night, and respect all fighters, let alone four that have done what these guys have done in the sport. But what if you combine the Wilder Chisora card, which we're about to talk about after this, and Spence Tszyu, and you just call it, since everything is numbered now, like Zuffa boxing and UFC, you just go in ring, Washed Wars 1, and all four guys lined up back to back, like Washed Wars 1, Wilder Chisora, Spence Tszyu, and loser is washed. That is the rules of the card. You are now branded. The winner gets to continue on. Okay,
I would call it Power Wash 1.
All right.